The automatic doors hissed open at exactly 9:03 a.m., breathing a sliver of golden sunlight onto the spotless floors of Guardian State Bank's West Haven branch. The scent of lemon polish clung to the morning air, mingling with the faint chemical note of freshly printed receipts. No one looked up, at least not right away. After all, the first customers of the day usually didn't matter, but this one was different. He rolled in quietly, the low hum of his wheelchair wheels barely louder than a breath. Elliot Dandridge, 63, wore a slate-grey windbreaker, a pair of neatly pressed navy slacks, and an old baseball cap pulled low just enough to shade his eyes. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but there was something in his presence that made the room pause for half a second longer than usual, though no one could quite place why. He didn't look like someone to notice. And that was exactly the point. A few employees were still adjusting their name badges, sipping lukewarm coffee from paper cups. One young teller yawned discreetly behind a pamphlet stand. Clients in the lobby scrolled mindlessly through their phones. Elliot made a slow circle of the room, glancing not at the people, but at the place the way one evaluates more than observes. Every corner, every detail, every silence. Then, with the calm precision of someone who'd done this 100 times before, he rolled up to the front desk. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but clear. "Could I speak with the branch manager, please?" The woman behind the counter looked up briefly, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Megan Alcott, platinum blonde, mid-30s eyeliner, sharp as glass mascara, like it had been applied for a photo shoot rather than a job in finance. Her mouth twisted slightly, and her eyes, he noticed, didn't quite meet his. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked flatly, flipping through a stack of deposit slips. "No, I don't," Elliot replied calmly. "But I'd appreciate—" She cut him off with a swift hand gesture. Not rude, just dismissive. Then, without even bothering to lower her voice, she turned to a colleague and said with a chuckle under her breath, "Betty's here to cash somebody else's check again, or maybe complain about the free coffee." The words weren't loud, but they landed. A teenager in the waiting area looked up from his phone, brow furrowed. His mother stiffened beside him. The air shifted just slightly, but enough. Elliot didn't blink. He tilted his head almost like he was recalibrating, measuring the weight of the moment. "I can wait," he said simply. "But I'd still like to speak with the manager." Megan sighed dramatically, as though he'd asked her to file taxes with a broken pencil. "Sir, unless you're a client here, the manager doesn't have time for walk-ins." "I'm not here to make a withdrawal," Elliot replied. Her eyebrows rose. "Then what are you here for?" Her voice rose with the question, not with curiosity, but irritation. And that's when the tone of the room shifted again, sharper this time, almost audible. From the side hallway, another voice cut in. "Is there a problem?" It wasn't loud, but it was enough to interrupt the moment. A man stepped into view, a Latino banker in his 40s with a blue badge that read Client Services Representative. His name was Eduardo, and the look in his eyes said he already knew what he'd walked into. Megan didn't flinch. "I've got it, Eduardo." Eduardo didn't move. "Miss Alcott," he said evenly. "You might want to lower your tone." She shot back quickly. "I said, I've got it." But the spell had already broken. Elliot looked at Eduardo and gave him a nod. Not big, not dramatic, just enough to say, "Thanks for showing up." And then, as if none of the disrespect had happened, Elliot turned back to Megan and said again, "Please, just the manager. That's all I'm asking." She rolled her eyes and grabbed a clipboard from behind the counter, slapping it down in front of him. "Fine," she said sharply. "Write your name. Someone might get to you in an hour." But Elliot didn't pick up the clipboard. Instead, he slowly opened a worn leather folder resting in his lap, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He didn't rush, didn't flinch, didn't let her tone penetrate the unshakable stillness he carried like armor. Elliot unfolded a tri-folded sheet of paper from his folder, his hands calm and deliberate. He placed it gently on the counter, sliding it toward Megan without a word. She stared at the paper for a beat too long, then shoved it aside with a manicured fingernail, like it was a menu at a diner she didn't want to order from. "If you're not going to sign in, I'm going to have to ask you to move out of the reception area," she said sharply, her words brittle. Still, he remained composed. "I'd appreciate it," he said, his voice unwavering. "If you could hand that to your branch manager." Megan scoffed. "Sir, we don't accept unsolicited paperwork. If this is a complaint, we have an online form." "It's not a complaint," Elliot replied, still steady. "It's documentation. I already told you," she snapped louder this time, cutting him off again. "You're not on the appointment schedule. So unless you're here for a deposit or to see a banker, you'll have to wait like everyone else." A ripple stirred through the lobby. A woman in scrubs near the coffee station whispered to the man beside her, "She's talking to him like he's a child." Others began glancing over, not openly yet, but not pretending not to listen either. But Megan didn't notice, or didn't care. She leaned her elbows on the counter, exhaling like she'd been burdened with something far beneath her pay grade. "Look, sir," she said, sarcasm thinly veiled. "I don't know why some people think that demanding attention gets them somewhere." Eduardo, still nearby, shifted his weight, but said nothing. His eyes stayed on Elliot, and Elliot, he didn't seem annoyed. If anything, he looked tired. Not from the morning, but from the pattern. This wasn't his first time navigating someone else's assumptions. He tapped the paper on the counter gently. "Again, I'd simply like you to pass this along." "Unbelievable," Megan muttered, folding her arms. At that moment, Eduardo stepped forward. Megan turned to stop him, her voice rising. He doesn't need to, but Eduardo held up a hand, not to Elliot, but to her. Quiet, controlled, commanding. He picked up the document and began reading. The room stilled again. Eduardo's expression shifted in less than 10 seconds. His brows tightened. His mouth opened just slightly. Then he looked at the bottom of the page, read it again, and stepped back from the counter. This is from corporate," he said slowly. Megan blinked. What Eduardo's eyes stayed fixed on the document. "You should get Brian. Now." Megan folded her arms tighter. For what Eduardo didn't raise his voice, but it hit like thunder. "Now, Megan." She hesitated, her bravado cracking at the edges. Without another word, she turned to the office phone, dialed 2 buttons, and turned her back to the room. Her voice dropped to a muffled murmur. Elliot didn't watch her. He was scanning the lobby instead. The boy from earlier was still staring now, motionless. His mother had placed her hand gently on his arm as if to say, "Watch closely." Eduardo remained still. He wasn't just observing, now he was standing guard. When Megan finally hung up, she stepped away from the desk, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'll be out when he can." Elliot turned to Eduardo again and said quietly, "Thank you." Eduardo nodded, the form still in his hand. "We don't get many visits from corporate. I didn't recognize you, sir." "That's the idea," Elliot replied simply. And Megan finally heard him, really heard him. Her eyes darted to Elliot's face, her expression draining of color. The word corporate still echoed in her head, but it was the "sir" that Eduardo had used that shook her the most. She blinked. You work for Guardian State." Elliot didn't answer, because in moments like these, silence says more than any confirmation ever could. Megan stepped back, but her heels didn't quite find solid ground. For a woman who wielded authority like a sharpened badge, the sudden shift in the air around her left her unmoored. She folded her arms across her chest, again tighter this time, not in power, but in defense. The smile she had worn earlier, tight, smug, had vanished. What replaced it was thinner, frailer, like she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it. But she still hadn't apologized, not once. Instead, she stood behind the desk, hoping that silence might reverse the current, that if she stood still enough, maybe the moment would pass her by without damage. It didn't. Across the lobby, Terence Holland, young, soft-spoken, and one of the newer tellers, watched intently. He'd just wrapped up helping an elderly client with her retirement deposit when he had heard Megan's tone shift, heard the disdain in her voice, saw the way she dismissed Eduardo, the man everyone respected more than their own job descriptions. Terence lingered at his counter, one hand resting near his phone. Then, almost unsure of himself, he unlocked it, opened the camera app, and hovered over the record button. He didn't press it yet. The teenager in the corner leaned toward his mum and whispered, "Is he like the boss or something?" His mother's eyes flicked from Elliot to Megan, then back again. "He doesn't need to be undercover," she murmured. "Look how quiet she got." Megan was still behind the desk, chewing on her thumbnail now. Her eyes kept darting to the hallway, as if anyone might walk through and make this moment go away. Someone to rescue her from herself. But no one came. Not yet. Then the front doors opened again with a soft hiss. A woman in a dark blue pantsuit entered, a calm force in heels. She paused just inside the doorway, sensing the tension immediately. Her gaze swept across the lobby before settling on Elliot. Her posture softened instantly. She walked straight over. Megan straightened up, eager. "Hi, welcome to Guardian State. I can help. I'm not here for a transaction," the woman cut in gently. Her voice carried the weight of familiarity and quiet command. Megan blinked. The woman turned toward Elliot, bent slightly, and said warmly, "Mr. Dandridge, I didn't know you'd be here today." He gave a soft smile. Neither did she. Megan froze. The way the woman addressed him, like an equal, like someone worth every ounce of her attention, shifted the balance of the room again. The murmurs fell into full-blown silence. Judith Emery, regional investment client, on a first-name basis with high-level management. Megan had seen her before, but never really spoken to her. Now Judith looked up and directly at Megan. "Is that so?" she asked, voice still polite but unmistakably pointed. Megan opened her mouth but stumbled on the first syllable. The words died in her throat. What was she even going to say? That she didn't recognize him? That she thought he was a walk-in with a complaint? Judith didn't wait for a response. "I'll be waiting over there," she said, nodding once toward the lobby chairs. "I was told Mr. Dandridge might be visiting sometime this month. Glad I happened to stop by." She turned and walked away without another glance at Megan. Terence hit record, not because he wanted to share it, but because this wasn't just an interaction anymore. This was a revelation. Elliot wasn't confronting anyone. He was simply existing, and that existence was slowly unraveling the facade around him. Megan was now pacing behind the counter, her arms locked tightly again. She was biting her lip hard. Her confidence had drained away, leaving her rigid and brittle, a woman who'd bet on her ability to control the room and just realized she never owned it in the first place. And Elliot, he said nothing, just sat there, hands folded lightly on the rims of his wheels, gazing out at the lobby as if watching time reset itself. Terence whispered to Eduardo from across the floor. "Is this really happening?" Eduardo gave a slight nod. "Every bit of it." And Megan, still hoping the manager would arrive and untangle her from the mess, leaned forward, hands trembling slightly as she said, "I didn't know who you were." Elliot turned his head slightly. "That's the point," he said softly. From the hallway, the soft click of a door opening echoed like a drumbeat across the quiet lobby. Everyone turned toward the sound, employees, clients, even Megan. It was as if they'd all been holding their breath, waiting for someone to step in and make sense of the moment unraveling before them. Brian Covington appeared, the branch manager. Tall, composed, early 50s, built like a former college linebacker, with just enough gray in his neatly combed hair to lend him the weight of authority. His dress shirt was crisply pressed, but his tie hung slightly loosened around his neck, the look of a man who liked to work rather than pose. His gaze swept across the lobby in a single pass. It landed first on Megan. Her posture shifted immediately, shoulders back, spine straighter, as if standing taller might undo the last 15 minutes. But she didn't speak. She didn't have to. Brian's expression had already absorbed the scene, registering every unspoken detail. Then his eyes found Elliot. And in a flash, recognition. It wasn't loud or theatrical, just the subtle tightening of his jaw, the small exhale of breath that betrayed what he'd just realized. "Mr. Dandridge," he said, his voice low, respectful. Elliot gave a small nod. "Brian." The temperature in the room dropped a full 10 degrees. Brian stepped forward and extended his hand. Elliot reached up and shook it firm, steady, like men who had met before under very different circumstances. "I wasn't told you'd be visiting today," Brian said carefully. "I like to keep things simple," Elliot replied. "Surprise visits help me see what's real." Brian nodded, his lips pressed thin. "Understood." Megan's head snapped toward them. "Wait, he's not just from corporate." Brian turned to her slowly. "Megan," he said tightly, "we'll speak later." She opened her mouth, tried to form a sentence. "I just didn't," he cut her off with a single glance. Not rude, not loud, but definitive. "Mr. Dandridge," he continued, turning back, "would you like to come into my office?" Elliot gestured toward the counter with one hand. "I've already submitted documentation." "That should explain why I'm here." Brian nodded. "I have it." Eduardo walked it over. He took the paper and scanned it quickly. His brows furrowed as he read, and the crease in his forehead deepened. Then, with a tight jaw, he stepped aside. "Follow me, please." Elliot turned his chair toward the hallway and began wheeling himself forward. But halfway there, he paused. He didn't turn his head, but his voice carried back toward the desk. "I assume you have cameras in this branch," Brian responded immediately. "Yes, sir. 6-point coverage, synced to the internal server." "Good," Elliot said. "I'd like to review this morning's footage before we continue." Brian's face barely moved, but the tension was clear. "Absolutely." That's when Megan stepped forward again, her voice cracking as she tried to salvage what was left. "Mr. Dandridge, I didn't mean anything by what I said. I just didn't know." Elliot turned back slowly, meeting her eyes for the first time in full. "You meant exactly what you said," he replied. "Not harshly, not bitterly, just truthfully. That's the problem." And with that, he wheeled down the hallway behind Brian, the silence behind him louder than any closing door. Back in the lobby, Judith closed her planner with a soft snap and gave Megan a look not cruel, but crushing in its disappointment. Terence slipped his phone back into his pocket. He didn't need the footage anymore. The truth was already louder than any video ever could be. Brian opened the door to his office and stepped aside to let Elliot pass through. The air inside was cool quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed for real conversations, the kind that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "Would you like anything?" "Coffee, water," Brian offered. "No, thank you," Elliot said, rolling forward and settling near the desk. Brian rounded the desk, logged into his computer, and pulled up the security feed. He tapped several keys, scrubbed back through the morning's timeline, and found what he was looking for. The moment Elliot entered. Megan's words, Eduardo's quiet resistance, the crowd's growing awareness, it was all there. They sat in silence as it played the hum of the computer, filling the space between them. Brian watched his own face in the corner of the screen when he'd finally appeared, saw his hesitation, his late arrival. "I need a copy of this sent to legal, Elliot," said his voice even. "Already done," Brian replied without hesitation. "The moment Eduardo brought me the document, I knew." Elliot turned his head toward him. "I'm not trying to fire people, Brian." "I know," Brian said, exhaling. "But you didn't come here to be spoken to, like a street beggar either." The two men sat in silence again, but this time it was less heavy, more mutual understanding. Brian looked tired, like a man realizing the cracks in the house he'd been trusted to maintain were wider than he'd thought. "There are things we've overlooked," he admitted. "I've let Megan slide before, sharp tongue, but her numbers were decent, so I let it go." Elliot didn't respond. He didn't have to. The footage said everything. Megan's tone, the dismissiveness, the entitlement, the assumption that she could treat someone poorly because she thought no one was watching. But today, Brian said, shaking his head, this was something else. Outside the office, the bank had gone strangely quiet. The usual printer hums and keyboard clicks had stilled. Conversations were hushed, movement was minimal. A shift had occurred, not one of panic, but of reckoning. Megan remained at the counter, arms crossed like a child, waiting to be called into the principal's office. Her jaw worked as though chewing invisible words she couldn't quite form into an apology. She glanced toward the hallway every few seconds, unsure whether to stand still or run. Terence lingered near the teller booths, fiddling with a paperclip. He wanted to return to the normal rhythm of transactions and balance sheets, but something held him there. Curiosity, guilt, maybe both. He looked over to Eduardo, still stationed quietly at his desk. "Is this really happening?" Terence whispered. Eduardo didn't move. Every bit of it. Across the room, Judith stood up, brushed off her skirt, and approached the cluster of chairs near the coffee station. She spoke clearly, not loudly, but with the kind of confidence that made people listen. "For those of you wondering," she said, "that man isn't just someone from corporate." Heads turned. "He owns part of this bank." There were gasps, muted disbelief. Someone near the back muttered, "No way." Judith gave a small shrug. "I've worked with him, brilliant investor, private, doesn't talk much. But when he does..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Mr. Fairley, an older client who'd been with the branch for over 2 decades, finally spoke for the first time. So he let her speak to him like that, and just waited. Judith nodded. "That's how he works. He watches before he acts. Megan turned sharply. Her laugh was hollow, unconvincing. This is crazy. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just following protocol. No one responded. She looked at Terence, searching his face for backup. He looked away. She turned to Eduardo. You know I didn't mean it like that. Eduardo didn't flinch. We both heard what you said, Megan. It was a joke, she snapped. Were you laughing? He asked. Silence. At that moment, the hallway door opened again. Brian emerged, first folder under one arm. Elliot followed behind, expression unreadable. Brian walked straight to Megan. Come with me, please. What? Why, what are you? She began, but trailed off. Something in his tone told her this wasn't a discussion. They disappeared into the back. The lobby held its breath again. Elliot didn't say a word, didn't gesture, just scanned the room, eyes meeting face after face. Some curious, some embarrassed, a few ashamed. He rolled slowly toward Terence. You were recording earlier, he said, not accusingly, just observantly. Terence swallowed. Yeah, I thought it might help. In case she denied it. You can delete it, Elliot said softly. Terence blinked. Sir, there's no need, Elliot repeated. The lesson's already here. Terence nodded and quietly deleted the file. I didn't know what to do, he admitted. She outranks me. I didn't want to get involved. You did fine, Elliot said. The hard part isn't speaking up. It's staying calm while the truth reveals itself. Across the room, the teenager whispered, He's not what I expected. His mother smiled. That's the point, baby. People never are. And Elliot, though he didn't turn, heard her. His shoulders eased just slightly. Not triumphant, just human. But in the back office, a different kind of reckoning had begun. Megan stood in the middle of Brian's office like the ground beneath her had turned to glass. She didn't sit, she didn't speak. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, but it no longer read as defiance, it looked like armor held together by nerves. Brian walked to his desk and slowly placed the folder down. He opened it with deliberate care. Inside were printouts, still images from that morning's footage. One by one, he laid them out on the desk. Megan's face appeared in every frame, frozen in expressions of disdain, impatience, superiority. Her voice cracked first. You're not serious. I'm not playing, Brian said flatly. This isn't a chat, Megan. This is documentation. She blinked fast. I didn't know who he was. Brian didn't move. That's not the point. If I had known, stop, he cut in. His voice was quiet, but there was a finality in it that froze her mid-sentence. Her eyes darted to the stills on the desk again, like they might suddenly tell a different story. Brian leaned back. Do you honestly believe it's acceptable to speak to anyone the way you did? Do you think the problem was that he was corporate, or that he was a man in a wheelchair? You thought you could ignore. I didn't mean it. You did, Brian said, eyes locked on hers. You just didn't mean to be caught. The room thickened with silence. Megan's mouth opened, but no words came out. The polish, the edge she wore every morning, like a second skin, was flaking. She looked smaller now, less styled, less certain. Brian lowered his voice but didn't soften it. Do you understand the position you've put this entire branch in? She didn't answer. That man didn't show up to fire anyone, he continued. He came to observe, that's all. And what you gave him was a performance that will follow you far longer than your quarterly numbers ever will. Megan's lip quivered. She reached, grasping I could apologize, publicly, to him, to everyone. Brian didn't budge. Do you think an apology rewrites what you showed them today? What you showed me, she looked down at the floor. Her voice was barely audible. You're really letting me go. I should have done it sooner, he said. Not because he told me to. He didn't. But because I finally saw what others have only whispered. Megan stood there for a long moment, waiting, hoping for a sliver of mercy. But Brian's expression didn't shift. Badge, credentials, he said simply. She hesitated too long. Megan, he said again, and this time her hands moved, slowly, shaking. She unclipped her name tag and placed it on the desk like it weighed 100 pounds. Then she turned the office iPad toward herself and tapped in her deactivation code. When she finished, she looked up, eyes glistening but unbroken. He humiliated me. Brian's response came without pause. No, he said calmly, you did that to yourself. She didn't argue. She turned and walked out. No drama, no outburst, just the quiet shuffle of someone who finally realized the mirror had been turned back on her. Outside the bank had settled into a quiet hum. Conversations had resumed, but with a new tone, slower, softer, more aware. Judith had returned to her seat. Elliot sat quietly near the front desk. The atmosphere was still heavy, but not with dread, with change. When Megan stepped out now, coat over her arm, her ID gone, her posture diminished, the lobby didn't react with gasps or whispers. It simply noticed. She kept her head down, didn't look at anyone, and walked straight to the exit. The door clicked shut behind her. Brian stepped into the lobby, next glanced toward Elliot. "All done?" Elliot asked. Brian nodded once. "Then I'd like to speak to the team," Elliot said. Brian turned to the break room and disappeared inside. Moments later, 6 employees stepped out: Eduardo Terrence, the young woman from loans, 2 tellers, and Clarence, the janitor. They formed a quiet half-circle, unsure what was coming next. Elliot didn't rise. He stayed in his chair, but when he spoke, the words rang through the room like something holy. "I didn't come here today to trap anyone," he began. "I didn't come to catch someone slipping or to fire a person. That's not my role." No one moved. "I came," he continued, "because every few months I visit our branches. Unannounced, no suits, no fanfare. I just show up, sit down and watch. Not to check your banking skills, but to see how people are treated when they don't look like they matter." Terrence's eyes dropped to the floor. The woman from loans shifted her stance. Even Eduardo looked like he was holding his breath. "Today," Elliot said, "I wasn't addressed as a client, or a man, or even a human being. I was treated like a problem. An inconvenience." He paused, letting it hang. "And the only reason that changed was because Megan realized I had power." The silence that followed was so complete it almost pulsed. "I've spent most of my adult life being underestimated," he said. "Dismissed, looked through. And that's fine. I've built quietly without ever needing validation." Then he looked at Terrence. "But you saw something was wrong. You pressed record. You didn't need to fix it. You just needed to acknowledge it." Terrence looked stunned. "I didn't know what else to do." "That's okay," Elliot said. "You did enough." Then he turned to Eduardo. "You spoke up not to protect me, but because it was the right thing to do. That means more than you know." Eduardo's voice was soft. "I thought I'd get written up." Elliot smiled faintly. "Maybe in another bank. Not this one." Then he looked back at the group. "Some of you said nothing. I get it. It's hard when someone above you is doing wrong. But remember this," he leaned forward, voice tightening just a notch. "The way you treat a person when you think they have nothing to offer you. That's the version of yourself the world remembers, and no one, not one person, dared to blink. The weight of those words, that's the version of yourself the world remembers, didn't just settle on their shoulders. It pierced through their uniforms, their roles, their rehearsed greetings. It found their human core. You don't have to be perfect," Elliot continued, his voice now gentler. "You don't have to save the day. But you do have to try." He looked around the room at the faces that had watched, hesitated, stayed silent, or stepped forward. Every person who walks through those doors trusts you with more than their money. They're trusting you with something much more fragile, their dignity. Judith, still standing quietly to the side, dabbed at the corner of her eye. "Megan lost her job today," Elliot said, pausing. "Not because of me, because she exposed something in herself that doesn't belong in a place built on trust." He turned his chair slightly, taking in the semicircle of staff once more. "This branch," he said softly, "can be better. You can be better. You can set the tone. You can create the kind of place where no one walks in wondering if they'll be respected." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "That choice isn't mine. It's yours." There was a pause, long, still, heavy. Then Brian stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I think we all needed to hear that, sir." Elliot nodded slowly. "Then let's hope you carry it with you." He began to wheel himself toward the exit. No applause followed. No one moved quickly. It was the kind of silence earned through reflection, not awkwardness. A hush rooted in the realization that they had all witnessed something they wouldn't forget. But just as Elliot approached the lobby entrance, someone stepped forward. Clarence Duval, the janitor, 65 years old, quiet, unassuming. The man who came in before the lights turned on and left long after the last customer had gone. Most people didn't notice Clarence unless he was pushing a mop or emptying trash bins. But Elliot noticed him, had always noticed people like him. Clarence nodded respectfully. "Sir, I just want to say thank you for how you handled this." Elliot turned slightly in his chair. "And your name, Clarence?" "Clarence Duval." Elliot gave a small smile. "Pleasure to meet you, Clarence." Clarence looked down for a moment, gathering his words. "I've worked in this branch since it opened, 30 years, maybe more. I've seen people come and go, people promoted who didn't know how to look others in the eye." He didn't say Megan's name. He didn't have to. "I've cleaned up after folks who thought they were too good to say hello." Clarence added, voice trembling slightly. "That kind of thing stays with a man." Elliot nodded. "Respect doesn't come from a title." "No, sir," Clarence replied. "It sure doesn't." Terence, still standing near the teller station, was watching like he'd stumbled into a parable. Then the woman from loans took a step forward, hesitant. I didn't know what to say earlier," she admitted, "but I saw what happened. And I should have said something." Elliot met her eyes. "And now you have," he said. She blinked, clearly expecting criticism but receiving grace instead. Around them, a few clients had begun collecting their things, but no one moved quickly. There was a lingering sense of reverence, as if everyone wanted to absorb just a few more seconds of whatever this was before the ordinary rhythm of the day returned. Near the door, Judith caught up to Elliot one more time. "If you ever decide to take a public-facing role," she said with a smile, "I'll be first in line to vote for you." Elliot chuckled. "No campaign signs in my future." She leaned in slightly. "That speech. It'll stay with people. Let's hope their actions match it," Elliot replied. Brian joined them, holding a sealed envelope. "I drafted an apology letter from the branch, addressed to you personally, though I doubt it captures the full extent of the day." Elliot accepted it, but didn't open it. "I'm not here for apologies, Brian," he said. "I'm here to see who this branch really is. And I saw it today." Brian nodded, glancing at the staff over his shoulder. "We'll be better." "Don't tell me," Elliot said. "Show them." And for a moment they just stood there. No words. Just the quiet current of mutual understanding. Back at the reception desk, Megan's absence was glaring. The empty chair, the unused clipboard. It all sat like a quiet reminder of what had been unmasked. Elliot turned toward the exit again. But before he could leave, Terence jogged up behind him. "Mr. Dandridge," he said, a little breathless. Elliot stopped. "I was wondering, would you ever consider coming back? Not to inspect, just to speak. Maybe to new hires, interns. I think people would really benefit from hearing you again." Elliot considered it. "That's not my job, son." "I know," Terence said quickly, "but I think it matters." There was something honest in the way Terence said it. Not flattery, not fear, just belief. Elliot smiled. "I'll think about it." "Thank you for today," Terence said. Then the automatic doors opened. Sunlight spilled onto the lobby floor. A woman near the exit stepped forward and held the door. Not because Elliot needed help, not because she had to, but because it was decent. "Have a good day, sir," she said with a smile. "You too," Elliot replied, quiet as ever, and he rolled down the ramp into the stillness of the parking lot. Even after Elliot disappeared into the sunlight, the branch didn't return to normal. Not really. Sure, transactions resumed. Clients stepped up to counters, phones rang again, but something had shifted, something invisible but undeniable. The rhythm of the bank had changed like a song that no longer played in the same key. Brian stood in the lobby for a long moment, arms crossed, scanning the room. He didn't speak, didn't rush. He was just taking stock of the space, of the people, of what had just transpired beneath his watch. The staff returned to their duties, but the air was different. At the teller window, Terence greeted the next client with direct eye contact and a steadiness that hadn't been there that morning. No longer just polite. He was present. At the loans desk, the young woman who had stepped forward finally asked 3 times if her client had any additional questions. She listened with care instead of waiting for her turn to speak. Eduardo lingered near the front a little longer than usual, not to supervise, not to monitor, but to witness. To be there quietly, the way only someone who truly understands presence can. Megan's absence echoed louder than any reprimand. the missing voice, the empty desk, the absence of her clipped footsteps. It was a silence that didn't ask to be filled, it deserved to remain. By late afternoon, Judith had already called corporate. Her report was calm, detailed, honest. "I've worked with Guardian State a long time," she told the regional office, "and today I saw something I hope you never forget. Your people don't need more training, they need more listening." That single quote would quietly circulate through the upper ranks in the weeks to follow, not as a reprimand, but as a mirror. Back at the branch, the teenager who had sat with his mum that morning came back alone this time. Still in his school uniform, a $5 bill in his hand. He walked up to Terence's window and placed the bill down carefully. "I just wanted to say—" He paused, eyes darting. "That guy, he was cool. I liked how he didn't yell." Terence smiled. "Me too." The boy held out the slip of paper. "I want to open an account here." Terence handed him a pen. "Best decision you'll make today." And in that single exchange, quiet, simple, unceremonious, the tone of the day found its anchor. Because this story wasn't about who got fired, it wasn't even about who gave the best speech. It was about something far smaller and far more important. Dignity. Outside, the sun had begun to dip. The glass walls of the bank caught the late golden light, stretching long shadows across the floors like brushstrokes on canvas. Clarence turned off the floor buffer and leaned it against the wall. Eduardo locked his drawer and tucked his notes into a folder. Terence double-checked the counters. One more deposit, one more smile. Then Brian stepped into the middle of the lobby. He looked around, his voice low, almost to himself. "Let's make sure we never need a reminder like that again." No one responded. But they heard him, and in a building where words had carried so much weight, that day silence finally felt earned. Because power doesn't always come loud, and character that's revealed when no one's watching. This wasn't just a story about a man in a wheelchair or a rude employee. It was a story about perception and what happens when people reveal who they really are. In a world where kindness so often takes a back seat to status, Elliot Dandridge reminded everyone that real power doesn't walk into a room demanding recognition. It watches, it listens, and when the moment calls for it, it teaches. If this story stirred something inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Some truths are quiet. They don't scream. They unfold in pauses, in the weight of a glance, in the hush, after someone chooses grace over ego. Elliot Dandridge didn't come to teach a lesson, but he left one behind anyway. He didn't rage, he didn't retaliate, he revealed. And through that stillness, he reminded us of something most people forget, that how you treat someone who can do nothing for you is the truest measure of who you are. So if this story made you feel, don't scroll past that feeling. Leave a comment. Respect is a choice. I choose it. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Not just to watch, but to wake up. Share this with someone who might need the reminder that your power doesn't come from your title. It comes from how you use your voice when no one expects you to. Because this wasn't just a story about a bank. It was a story about value. Not the kind locked in vaults, the kind that lives in the choices we make when no one's keeping score. So if you ever find yourself in Megan's shoes, remember, appearances can deceive, but character always reveals itself. And if you ever find yourself in Elliot's place, may you carry yourself with the quiet strength that moves a room without raising your voice. Because real power doesn't perform. It leads by example.